Welcome, welcome. Just making sure everybody's in. Looks like almost. Always a scrim at the door here. It's good to see everybody. Happy Thursday, wherever in the world you are. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning and A Daily Dose of Talmud. And this is, of course, our week in review class. What did we learn in Talmud this week? It's very interesting. All right, little pun to start your Thursday. All right, so
I got it. I got it.
I'll stop being corny. This morning, of course, this class is taught by our rotation of excellent teachers. And this morning for me anyway, we are joined by Rabbi Elliot Goldberg. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Rachel. First, I thought you were being vague. It's very interesting this week in Talmud. And then I got the reference to this week we finished studying the chapter of Bava Metzia that talks about the rules of interest. I got it. I'm a quick study. It took me a minute, but thank you for that. We're going to do two things today at once from different that each have it's different ways to read or think about the Talmud. One will be about the content of the chapter that we wrapped up this week about interest, and another will be a little bit about how ideas develop in the Talmud and how we can spot them by looking at the layers of the conversation, which leads to a little conversation about when we say we're reading the Talmud, which was put together over many, many, many generations, centuries actually. Who are we really reading? Right? Whose opinion, whose work, are we reading when we read the Talmud? So we'll get to that a little bit at the end. Welcome everybody from all over the world and many time zones and across the pond even, I see. I am putting in the chat a link to today's slides, which I'm going to share in a minute, but I know some of you like to open them up somewhere on your screen and follow along on your own. And so that's there in the chat, and we're gonna jump right in. One last comment before I do, though, so I guess we're not jumping right in, but one last comment is I'm going to start with the last Mishnah of the chapter, but then we're going to go backwards half a page to some things that appear before it. But as you know, there are ways in which the Talmud, it doesn't really have a beginning and an ending, because on the very first page of Talmud, if you remember back, 4 years ago already, 3.5, 4 years ago, a long time ago, the first page of Talmud is ostensibly about the Shema, but in order to understand it, you have to know things from all over the Talmud, which in the Daf Yomi cycle, we weren't even close to getting to yet. So pulling from one page and then a page before it feels Talmudic to me. Right, here we go. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, my button froze. Give me just a second. I seem to, there we go. My computer was waking up. All right, here we go. Slideshow. There we go. Look at that. All right. This is, so when you look at this in 6 months, you know when we looked at it. And here is from the beginning of the last Mishnah. It's sort of a good summary. There are ways in which a modern writer might have put this up top in a chapter that's talking about the prohibition about charging interest. The Mishnah tells us at the end of the chapter, if interest is in fact charged, who is culpable? And the Mishnah says, these are the people who violate a prohibition of interest. So if there's a case of interest charging, who's on the hook? The lender, right? The bank, or it's not necessarily the bank, the individual who's lending money to others. The borrower is also culpable for accepting an agreement in which they're charged interest. The guarantor, if someone puts up a guarantee for the loan and there's interest involved, they're also on the hook. And the witnesses, those who sign the documents to just create the paper trail that says the loan has happened. And the rabbis add also the scribe. Even the person in the room who's writing the document is culpable. So as I read this, it felt like this is a pretty strong list. it seemed to me from the tone of the chapter, the discussions about the prohibition for lending interest fell on the lender. Right? The Torah says you're not supposed to lend with interest. You're not supposed to charge interest. And that, to me, said, thinking about the verses in the Torah, well, that's the person who has the money who's giving it to someone else. When you give money for a short amount of time to somebody else, don't add interest to it or to the agreement. But all these other people are added. So the people who are part of, I guess, the banking infrastructure or the loan infrastructure, the guarantor, the witness, and even the scribe, the logic makes some sense to me in terms of adding those to the category of the lender, because those are all people who help facilitate the loan. It's interesting to me that the person who's in need of a loan is also appears on this list, especially because it happened to be our pre-call chat, Rachel and I, that in the rabbinic world, the notion of giving a loan is sort of under the category of tzedakah, right? In the category of charity. Someone is in need of money, and you give it to them instead of permanently for short term. You shouldn't take advantage of the situation by charging them for it. It should be out of your generosity of your heart, right? The same way, like you need to borrow some sugar, I'm going to give it to you. You need to borrow my lawnmower, I'm going to lend it to you, and you'll bring it back. You need some money because you're stuck, I'm going to give it to you, and you'll give it back to me at some agreed upon date. But if there's interest involved, which the Torah and the rabbis seem to say as a coercive element, where that the lender is sort of coercing, or taking advantage of the person in need, the person in need is still culpable for accepting a loan on these terms. And the fact that that's added in here sort of puts the stamp at the end of the chapter that says, if you've been following along, this is a serious thing, but here's how serious it is. We're going to hold anyone who is a part of anything that has interest involved responsible. I mean, if you were to look at the rest of the Mishnah, which we're not going to do so today because of time, it actually lists a whole series of verses, right? The discussion of the Mishnah part lists all the different verses in the Torah that these people are violating if they were to be a part of an exchange of short-term exchange of funds that include interest. So that's the Mishnah with which we end the chapter. It adds this serious note to the conversation and puts that rabbinic stamp that says, don't do this. Which led me to think about, as I read this Mishnah, two things that appeared right before, at the end of the discussion of the previous Mishnah, where the rabbis bring up some exceptions, but not like some of the technical exceptions we've seen over the course of the chapter, where we're trying to investigate, like, if I lend you some wheat today and you give it back to me tomorrow, but the market price has changed, is that interest? Where, like, it's a little more subtle. These are pretty more obvious examples where there's interest, where the rabbis are permissive, in contradistinction to what this Mishnah and really what the chapter says. So here's the first one. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says it is permitted for Torah scholars to borrow from one another with interest. So I read this and I said, wait, what? No one, right, and especially in lines with the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah says no one, no matter what role you play, can charge with interest. But Torah scholars, which, the rabbis and Talmud, it's sort of us, yeah, we can do it. And that gave me pause. If this is such a serious rule, why wouldn't this be one of the cases where we hold Torah scholars to a higher standard? Why would we give Torah scholars the opportunity to lend interest to each other? You could argue that maybe within Torah scholar circles, it's okay. We're going to come to that in a minute. But it would strike me that the logic of the chapter says this exception seems out of bounds. What does the Gemara do with this? It's a little uncomfortable with the statement, and it explains it away sort of this way. What's the reason for this? The Gemara asks. It's because the Torah scholars, are fully aware that interest is prohibited. So already I was questioning it's permitted for them to do it because they know it's prohibited. So that's not enough to explain it to me. And the extra payment, meaning the interest, is a gift they give to one another freely. So I give you $100 and you give me $110 back. The $10 isn't interest; it's a gift. Or the example that the Gemara brings is not with money, but very similar. It's a, oh, sorry. I'm trying to move my Zoom menu away from the words on my screen and advance the slide. Sorry about that. The example they give it is Shmuel says to Avua bar Ihi, lend me 100 peppers in exchange for 120 peppers I will give you at a later date. And you should know that this matter is fitting. A little vague. He just says, this is okay for you to give me 100 peppers and me to give you back 120 peppers because it's okay. It could mean it's fitting because it's permitted because he knows Shmuel's teaching. But the commentators say, well, it's fitting because that extra 20 peppers is a gift, right? Know that when I say I'm going to give you, you give me 100 peppers now, I'm going to give you back 120 peppers. It's not interest. That's a gift. It's a gift from me to you. No worries about it. That's the example they bring to support this sort of lending. So wonder a little bit about this example. So first, I just want to note, though, on the technical side, Shmuel is saying, lend me 100 peppers and offers to give him 120 back. So it's the borrower who's offering an additional sum. Could be on the technical side, right? It's not the person who's giving the loan that gives interest. And maybe then they're doing it freely. There's no coercion here. It's out of free will. If you do me this favor by giving me peppers, which I really need right now because I have a pepper fix, or I'm hosting a pepper festival at my house, or for whatever the reason he doesn't say, I'll give you back some extra, for your trouble. Sounds like could be a gift and not interest. At the same time, given the tone of this chapter, this strikes me as a little odd because we've seen many examples like this where an extra thing, gift or not, or however you frame it, is considered interest. But within the world of Torah scholars, says Rabbi Yehuda that Shmuel taught, this sort of arrangement is okay because the Torah scholars, right, the rabbis are experts in this and they would never think of doing something with interest. So it must be a gift, and we'll accept this explanation that Shmuel says it's fitting. It's interesting to note that it's the Shmuel here who's offering the interest is the same person who gives authority for the rabbis to charge each other interest in the statement before. So he's consistent with the statement that's above, but still seems at odds with the spirit of the chapter, and seems maybe a little out of place or a little funny that the rabbis make an exception for themselves just because they're rabbis. So that's exception example number one. And here is number two. We'll come back. We're going to circle back after we look at these different examples as well. So we'll come back to that one. So similarly, Rav Yehuda says that Rav says it's permitted for a person to lend their children and members of their household with interest. Here the explanation is included in the original statement instead of before we saw the Gemara brought up afterwards. Why does Rav say this? In order to have them taste the taste of interest. A little cryptic. But so first, here's the first exception was rabbis with each other can lend interest. So now we're saying in the family, charging interest, lending with interest is okay. Also struck me as odd. Why would, why would, the same way I question, why would the rabbis give themselves permission to do this? Why would they give permission for family members to do it for each other? I don't know if you've ever, I guess it depends on the family structure, but I don't know if you've ever had to lend or borrow money within family. Sometimes it's smooth and some family dynamics can handle that well. Sometimes it gets really messy when, a cousin borrows money and doesn't pay back, and then you don't know what to do about it. I can imagine a smooth lending of money from one party to another, or a complicated one within families. But this particularly allows for the lending of money for this interesting explanation, for them to have the taste, for them to taste the taste of interest. What does that mean? Interest doesn't taste. You can put interest on your peppers, I guess. We saw from the previous example. I don't know if that adds to the taste. So what does this mean here, the taste of interest? And what does it mean for them experience? there are a number of different explanations out there. The one that landed that made the most sense to me was if interest is something that is not good, this perhaps is an educational moment. You lend money with interest to a relative and they see how interest can become a burden and they learn interest is bad. So it's educational. I'm going to lend my kids, money and I'm going to charge them interest. And as a result of that, they'll see how it's harder to pay back and maybe the interest payments keep growing. And that's how they'll learn that you shouldn't play with interest because it's dangerous because of its effects like that. I'm not sure as a parent that that's the educational philosophy I would take with my children. Here, I'm going to give you a credit card and encourage you not to pay the statement monthly. And that's how you learn that credit card debt is bad and, can run away or take over your finances. I'm not sure that's the approach. Our approach is saying to the kids, Goldberg's pay the monthly. We use the credit card for cash flow management and pay the statement in full because interest is bad, so bad you don't even want to taste the taste of it. But Rob seems to permit it, and it seems to be somehow it's educational. Tasting interest will serve them in the future. But alas, says the Gemara, this is not correct because they may become corrupted. Meaning the experience of charging interest is not a good thing. And tasting the taste of interest isn't something we want to do. I guess the Gemara agrees with the Goldberg philosophy. It leads you down a path to poor financial practice, maybe as a loaner, maybe as a borrower. Better to just avoid it because this interest is not something we want to deal with. And education through bad experience isn't how we want to go because it might not turn out well on the other side. The same way we might, don't gamble a little bit in a safe way because you might get the gambling bug and then it could lead down to gambling addiction where you have trouble later on. So here the Gemara brings us these two exceptions and then discusses each of them. So I want to go back. You may have noticed I did some color coding on my screen. And I did that because in both of these examples, here I'm going to go backwards now. The yellow statements are early Amoraic statements where second, third, fourth generation Amora, right, rabbi of the Talmud quotes a first generation, the teaching of a first generation scholar that makes a short statement of law without much explanation, and the Gemara comes and then fills it in. Right, so if we look back at the first example, right, we have Rav Yehuda quoting a tradition that he learned about Shmuel and says it's permitted for the Torah scholars to borrow from one another with interest. This is in line with many of Shmuel's statements in the Talmud, meaning it's short, it's to the point, it makes a legal statement, there's not a lot of conversation. And the earliest layers of the Talmudic text, when commenting on whatever topic the Mishnah raises, look like this. Sometimes Shmuel is quoted directly, meaning it just says Shmuel says. Sometimes someone quotes Shmuel. Recently, I wrote a piece, if you're following our daily email, about how much we can trust the second, the later generation person, Shmuel, right? I wrote about a case where someone raises a question that says, that doesn't sound right. Did Shmuel really say that? And then the quoter gives more context, and it turns out they misinterpreted Shmuel in the first place. I wish I could remember which page that was so I can refer you to it. But here's a statement there. And then the rest of this conversation that follows that I have here in white is much later. Later than Shmuel, later than Rav Yehuda. It's from the later conversation of later generations of the Gemara, perhaps a century or more later, that says, what's the reason for this? Right? The reason, Shmuel's statement isn't challenged early on. It takes until later till they say, what's the reason for this? That question, what's the reason for this, I think is a really good one, given how at odds Shmuel's statement seems to be, as I said before, with the conversation of this chapter, and tries to explain away what Shmuel's saying. And what they say here is, well, Shmuel says it's permissive to borrow with interest, but he doesn't really mean interest. It's permitted for scholars to borrow from each other and for the borrower to give back something extra, a bonus, a gift, a something. And it's not interest because the rabbis are technical enough to understand the difference. And what this does is takes this exception that Shmuel sort of gives us in a blanket way and says, no one can do this except for us rabbis when we're by ourselves in the Beit Midrash or in our backyards or wherever the rabbis hung out. And the reason why we could do this is not really that we're permitted to charge interest, but we're permitted to give each other gifts. And the example that follows shows the borrower, out of the kindness of his or her heart, here it's a him, gives the extra because. Right, we saw an example earlier about though it's okay for someone, right, a merchant to give one of their customers a gift, right? A promotional item that says, "Pay me now, and later you get what you bought, and I'm going to throw in a free sweatshirt from my store." That give back is okay because it's a business. It's a giveaway to promote business and good customer relations. Here, the Gemara is on that theme as well, saying, well, what Shmuel is really permitting is, a kindness, not a charging of interest. And so, while Shmuel said you can charge interest, he doesn't really mean interest. What he means is you can give a gift, and we trust rabbis to step into this zone because they know better. They won't err. They'll do it the way that's above board. And what this does is, I think, in the later conversation, dials back the earlier Amoraic tradition that's quoted earlier in the Gemara. And we see the same pattern in this second example as well. Rav Yehuda quotes Rav. It happens here, it's a string of statements by Rav Yehuda quoting earlier sages. Just as a side note or a tangent, sometimes once Rav Yehuda quotes one earlier sage, the Gemara is tempted to bring any related tradition that they know on this topic or something similar where Rav Yehuda quotes somebody from the earlier generations. And so here we have a couple of these statements in a row. There are chapters where you see, Rabbi Eliezer says that someone says, and there are 11 straight, and by the 11th one, you're in a whole different topic. Here we just have a couple. Rabbi Yehuda says that Rav says, right, it's okay to learn, the blanket statement is you can land in to members of your household, to members of your family. He provides a little explanation of why. So Rav gives a little more than Shmuel gave, but the Gemara quickly says, well, then again, we're not sure that we like this. They might become corrupted. And note here, what the Gemara does is it doesn't bring a counter tradition, right? In other cases, we might see Rav Yehuda says that Rav says you can charge interest within the family, and then it might say, and Shmuel says that you can't. And then the rabbis will debate what's Rav's source, what's Shmuel's source, who's right, who's wrong, where we put Rav against one of his contemporaries and judge between two different opinions of scholars from the same time and place, and then pick one. Here's an instance where the Gemara just says, nope, Rav said this, and it's not true. And how are they able to contradict Rav right? In some ways, sometimes the later authorities in the Gemara aren't given permission. They don't have authority to argue with people who came earlier. Meaning rabbis of the Gemara can't contradict a Mishnah, which is from an earlier time, unless they have another text from that earlier time to support them. The same way, usually someone can't contradict Rav unless they have one of his contemporaries or an earlier text that contradicts Rav. But here the Gemara just comes and says, nope, Rav, this isn't right. And what's their justification? They don't agree with his reason. Rav's opinion falls because he provides an explanation. We want to give them a taste of interest, which the implication is that Rav thinks that's a good thing. It's educational. It will serve them well in their life. And the Gemara says, yeah, but that doesn't really work out that way. There's a risk of them being corrupted. And because of that, we're going to reject Rav's teaching from before. So what do we see here? In both of these examples, we see an early Amoraic statement, and we see it recontextualized, re-explained, or even rejected by later authorities. Now, if you're reading the text and you're not paying attention or noticing the layers, right, you could read through these two examples and just see it as one conversation of a whole bunch of people in a room. where there's a difference of opinion, where someone says something and then it's contextualized or it lands somewhere else. But pulling it out this way that I did with the color coding, um, I'll go backwards as well. You could sort of, you see an early statement and a revision later, right? The early statement's in yellow and the revision later is in white, which leads me just to call out what I think is important to notice when you're sensitive to the layers of the text, that ultimately the later generations of rabbis who put the Talmud together are the ones who shape the conversation and make the decisions. Right, earlier in the Beit Midrash, the two traditions that Rabbi Yehuda brought were taught by really authoritative folks, founders of yeshivas in Babylonia from the early generations. Right, Rav and Shmuel are the Hillel and Shammai of the Talmud, right, and they're quoted all over, and we hold their opinions dear. When they when they disagree with each other, we have to decide who to follow. That's one thing. But here, the contradiction is sort of with the spirit of the chapter. And the Gemara and the later generations find ways to reposition their statements or downright reject them, and they could do that because they're the editors at the end. The Gemara itself and rabbinic literature afterwards says halacha katrai, right? The law follows the last voice, which sometimes goes is contradictory to the Talmudic approach that the early authorities, right? The Torah is the most authoritative, then the Mishnah, then the Talmud, and the further back you go in time, the more authoritative you are. But actually, the Gemara recognizes that by crafting the argument, you get to shape it. And we see that in these two small examples, how the last voices, which came at the end, got to recontextualize the original statements and bring them in line to the spirit of this chapter as a whole, and really shape what we're reading. And it's something to look for and notice, not just in these small examples, but when you read Talmud as a whole, to try to see who's speaking, when are they coming, what period of time are they coming from, and what happens to their argument over time. It can be hard to do if you're new to Talmud and you're not familiar with the rabbis and what generations they come from and when it switches from an earlier statement to a later voice. I would say that the Sefaria digital version of the Talmud is helpful in part because if you hover over the name of a rabbi, it tells you where they lived and what generation of scholar they were, which can help you put the sources in order. And then often it's the switch from Hebrew to Aramaic that signifies we move to the later generations of editors of the Talmud, which if you're reading in the original is easier to notice than if you're reading an English translation. But the more you read, the more you can notice these the editorial seams and see how the conversation is shaped by those who added their voices left. All right, I'm going to end my screen share.
I always appreciate a reminder of how powerful editors are.
Oh, yes. This is a good time to shout out from my editors, Rafael and Ben, who those of you who read me should know my pieces are at least 25% better every day because of Rachel and Ben. I turn in some okay things. And then when I get them back, they're awesome. And that's a shout out for the editors, not just in the Talmud, but on my Jewish Learning site as well. We're gifted with awesome editors, and it's been a pleasure to learn from them as a writer. And we all benefit from their invisible hand in the daily Daf Yomi email and many other things at my Jewish Learning.
Oh, well, that's very sweet. I think of the writers as my teachers. They teach me, and I help them refine some ideas and thoughts and language. But
nice. So based on
you
that,
all I have the pleasure of hiring you all to teach me Talmud. So very
there
simple.
you go. And maybe because of that, we can lend each other loans with interest. Ooh. That's a conversation for another day. Oh,
for another day.
I did a poor job of leaving time for questions, and I see 30 comments in the chat. I have a Zoom.
We do have a lot of comments. I think can we take one or two and then we'll let folks go?
I have a minute or two, but also understand that those who have to go might have to click off. And sure.
Yeah, so for instance, some of it was discussion as you were going of what people were seeing. We have a question about the role of the redactors, and I think it is good to define that term, redactors, because we don't use that a lot in contemporary English. At least I don't, outside of the Talmud. If other people use the word redactor in another way, let me know. But the redactors are one of the terms we use for the late hands in the creation of the Talmud, who have assembled all these earlier sources and shaped the discussion. And often their words are not attributed to anyone. So they're often anonymous, but they have sort of, they're sort of editors, sort of writers, right? They bring the traditions and decide what order to present them and put the glue around them in the discussion. But many of the traditions, of course, are much earlier and not their words.
And
So I guess
some of the most Talmud-like back and forth complex logical conversations come from them.
Oh yes, Janina's reminding me that right, redacted is used if like you have a government document and part of it is blacked out, right? Sort of a different sense.
But yes,
Yes,
we
so
have
they're
that with
also
the
called the
Talmud,
stum, also called the Savoraim. They go by many names.
right? Sometimes when we talk about the redactors of the Talmud, there were portions of the Talmud that were redacted by the church. Because the church through the Middle Ages had the libraries and had Talmuds, and some of the things that were problematic were blanked out, and we have them from non-church manuscripts. So sometimes we say the Talmud was redacted and we mean taken out. Sometimes we say the Talmud was redacted and we mean by its editor.
Yeah, so that's a helpful distinction, different meaning of redacted. And then we have a question about, I lost it on my screen, something about isn't the Mishnah oral Torah. So let's just have a quick reminder of what we mean when we say oral Torah. Is that the Mishnah? Is that the Talmud? Is that both?
Right. So the biggest definition is the oral Torah is everything after the Torah, including this conversation of Talmud right now, meaning anything that's not written Torah is oral Torah. At some point historically, right, and after the destruction of the temple and under Roman persecutions, when the rabbis were worried that the oral Torah would be lost because it was harder to train people to memorize it, and there was a lot of persecution, the efforts to start to write it down happened, and the oral Torah became written. A fluid oral tradition became a written tradition. There's one process that happened with the Mishnah. Many scholars think the earliest conversations about the Mishnah in Israel and Babylonia about the Mishnah that became the Talmud also were oral and memorized until they ultimately got written down. So it's an odd thing because the oral Torah, for the most part, is now written also. And so really the difference between oral Torah and written Torah is, right, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Bible, and everything rabbinic later. And there's probably a lot of good stuff on My Jewish Learning.
In fact, I believe I wrote this article, though it's under the My Jewish Learning byline here. There's an article we have on what is the many uses of the word Torah and what it means in the Jewish tradition and different things we might mean when we say the word Torah.
Nice.
So if that's and I believe there's probably, though I haven't looked at it recently, there's probably a link out to our piece on oral Torah in that article as well. So we should let folks move on with their day. It was lovely to see you all. Thank you for all the really interesting questions and discussion. Always learn lots from you guys. Thank you, Rabbi Goldberg, for this presentation. And we will see you next week on Thursday.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good week, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.